Okay, so let's dive in. We're tackling some incredibly heavy territory today,
Definitely.
really confronting the reality of human suffering and, well, the very dark places it can sometimes lead people.
Yeah, the sources we're looking at don't shy away from that at all. They bring up these awful examples, Sandy Hook, Columbine, the Colorado theater shooting.
Horrific events, places where you see this immense pain almost curdle into something utterly destructive.
That's right. And the material today really uh, zeroes in on a core problem you see in those situations. It's this mindset where someone comes to view existence itself, being, as the source sometimes calls it, as fundamentally corrupt.
Contemptible, even.
Exactly. They set themselves up as the ultimate judge, the ultimate critic, and decide the world is so rotten that, well, the only response is destruction, negation.
It is chilling. You see it so starkly in the writings of one of the Columbine killers, saying things like, the human race isn't worth fighting for, only worth killing.
A terrifying sentiment.
And then kill mankind.
Yeah.
It's not just violence, it's this profound philosophical rejection of reality. The source calls it reaching a kind of religious depth.
Yes, like a deep-seated spiritual problem with reality itself. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack that powerful temptation, the temptation to negate being.
And then contrast it.
And then contrast it with this other, really challenging idea the source proposes. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world, exploring where that dark despair originates and what the potential is for a completely different path.
Okay, so let's start with that temptation, the negation.
Well,
How do the sources explore this destructive impulse?
well, they bring in a really powerful literary figure, Mephistopheles from Goethe's Faust.
Ah, okay.
Mephistopheles literally calls himself the spirit who negates. His whole philosophy, stated right there in the play, is basically all that comes to be deserves to perish, wretchedly.
Wow.
If it were better, nothing would begin. Just total rejection.
Pure hatred for creation itself.
Exactly. And the source argues that, okay, most people don't articulate it quite like Mephistopheles, but that core sentiment connects to a very human experience.
How so?
When we face injustice or tragedy or just our own limitations,
Yeah.
the unavoidable suffering in life, that temptation can bubble up. The temptation to question, being maybe even to curse it.
Right. That's when the big question arises.
The fundamental one. Why must innocent people suffer so terribly?
It feels almost universal, doesn't it, that question?
It really does.
Yeah.
Life is hard. Everyone faces pain, loss, their own fragility. Sometimes it feels like our fault, but often it just happens. We didn't ask for it. So when something awful occurs, that why quickly turns into whose fault is this? And that search for blame, well, it can lead straight to blaming reality itself.
And the sources point to someone like Leo Tolstoy. Even at the absolute height of his fame, his success,
Yeah.
he was grappling profoundly with this.
Yeah, he came to this rational conclusion that life was, in his words, evil and meaningless.
Which is terrifying coming from someone like him.
And his logic about what to do about that was chillingly direct. He identified 4 ways out of that despair. 3 were basically escapes, right? Ignoring it, chasing pleasure, or just sort of weakly carrying on.
But the fourth.
But for those he called strong and logically consistent, he argued there was only one truly honest path,
Self-destruction.
the destruction of life.
Suicide. Yeah.
And this is where the source draws this really disturbing connection. They link Tolstoy's very personal conclusion, not just to suicide, but outwards, to mass murder.
Seeing it as a kind of tragically effective existential protest.
Against being itself.
It's a horrific idea. The source actually cites a statistic that there were 1,000 mass killings in the U.S. in just 1,260 days leading up to June 2016.
That's staggering. Almost 1 a day for over 3 years.
Essentially, yeah. 5 out of 6 days. And while we struggle to comprehend these acts, the source suggests that figures like Tolstoy, well, they understood the underlying logic of that despair over a century ago.
And even further back, the authors of the Cain and Abel story. Exactly. They depicted the very first major act after leaving Eden, not just as murder, but killing your own brother.
Someone innocent, favored.
Right. And doing it specifically, as the source puts it, to spite the creator of the universe. It perfectly illustrates this idea of outrage aimed at existence itself, that deep resentment, that feeling of being fundamentally wronged by the structure of reality. And this brings us to the crucial fork in the road the source explores. Vengeance or transformation.
Because the psychological reaction to suffering so often is about blame, isn't it? Why me? Who did this?
Yes. Whether you point the finger at fate, or God, or another person, or even yourself, the core mechanism is seeking accountability. And one really powerful primal path is vengeance.
We saw that in the Columbine writings.
Absolutely. That desire to kill whoever I deem unfit for anything, especially those perceived to have caused harm or who represent something hated.
The source also uses the incredibly disturbing example of Karl Panzram.
Oh yes, a truly harrowing story. Brutalized repeatedly in institutions as a kid, his rage just grew exponentially, from hating specific people to hating all of mankind.
And the source argues his horrific acts, the rapes, murders, arson, they weren't just random violence. They were expressions of outrage aimed ultimately at being itself, as if targeting God or whoever was responsible for his suffering.
And Cain and Abel is that ancient prototype. Cain feels rejected, he's suffering, so he kills Abel, God's favorite, primarily to spite God. It's vengeance elevated to this ultimate symbolic level against creation.
It really forces you to wrestle with these incredibly difficult questions the source raises. Like, how can someone like Panzram, who endured such horror, possibly be expected to forgive?
Right. Or when does the demand for vengeance actually become indistinguishable from a demand for justice?
And after a real atrocity, is forgiveness just weakness, cowardice?
These are agonizing questions. And the source doesn't pretend there are easy answers. It acknowledges the profound moral weight here. But having stared into that abyss of despair and vengeance, it then pivots. It explores the alternative path.
A transformation.
And this is where Nietzsche comes in.
Yeah. The idea that distress, suffering, it doesn't have to lead to nihilism. It actually permits multiple interpretations. You can potentially learn good from experiencing evil.
Okay, but is there real-world proof of that beyond philosophy?
Well, the source offers a pretty compelling statistical point. The vast majority of adults who were abused as children do not go on to abuse their own children. Think about it. If abuse just automatically replicated itself, the number of victims would explode generationally, right? Way beyond the population. But it doesn't. People contain it. They actively choose not to pass it on.
They stop the cycle.
They stop the cycle. And the source sees this as powerful evidence for, quote, the genuine dominance of good over evil.
That's a really striking perspective, and the source backs this up with some incredibly moving individual stories. Yes, like the renowned artist, Native Canadian artist, who was horribly abused as a 5-year-old in one of those residential institutions. And after years caught in self-destruction, hatred, he just made a conscious choice. He stopped. He reconnected with his cultural traditions, started mentoring young men, found peace through his art, carving these magnificent totem poles, canoes, holding a huge potlatch ceremony.
He just decided...
He decided to be a good person, as the source puts it, and did the incredibly hard work of turning his life around.
And there was another example, the client from a really rough background.
Yeah, bitter, resentful grandmother, addict father, just generations of trouble. But when she had her own son, she consciously refused to repeat it. She poured everything into raising him well, actively choosing to sew up that tear in the cultural fabric of her family.
Instead of making it wider, she broke the chain.
Exactly. Powerful proof that transformation is possible, even when the past is incredibly dark. And there's a fascinating insight from T.S. Eliot's play, The Cocktail Party. A character suffering deeply expresses this strange hope. She hopes her misery is actually her own fault.
That seems backwards. Why hope it's your fault?
Well, her logic is surprisingly sharp. If it's her fault, if she contributed to it somehow, then she has agency. She might be able to do something about it.
Ah, I see.
But if reality itself is just inherently flawed, if the universe is designed to make her miserable no matter what, well, then she's doomed.
Right.
She can't change the fundamental nature of reality, but maybe, just maybe, she can change herself.
And the source presents Alexander Solzhenitsyn as perhaps the ultimate real-world example of this principle.
Absolutely. I mean, think about what he endured. World War II, then imprisoned by his own side in the Soviet gulag, cancer, just unimaginable hardship.
He had every reason imaginable to just drown in bitterness and vengeance against Stalin, the guards, the whole system.
But he didn't. Instead of just cursing his external reality, he chose to look inward, to examine his own life.
Asking himself.
Asking, how did I contribute to this catastrophe? He looked back at his own past actions, his early support for communism, times he'd acted against his conscience, lies he told, compromises he'd made.
And that self-examination wasn't just navel-gazing. It led to action.
It was the catalyst for deliberate change. He decided to stop making those kinds of mistakes. He observed the truly decent people around him, even in the camps, and learned from their integrity. He essentially took himself apart and rebuilt himself on a foundation of truth.
And the result wasn't just personal salvation.
Far from it. The result was the Gulag Archipelago, a book with such devastating truth, such moral force, that it arguably shattered the intellectual credibility of communism around the world.
Wow. One man's decision to set his own house in order instead of just cursing his fate literally changed the world.
It's incredible. The source mentions figures like Havel, Gandhi, as operating from a similar kind of principled personal responsibility.
Which brings us right to that core directive running through this whole deep dive, setting your house in order.
Right. And the source looks at the historical perspective of the ancient Hebrews here, the Old Testament prophets.
Despite incredible suffering, exile, defeat by huge empires,
their consistent message wasn't primarily blaming the Babylonians or the Egyptians or even God. It was blaming themselves for failing to live up to God's laws, for failing to adhere to the covenant.
It reminds me of the source's analogy about the New Orleans hurricane.
Yeah, exactly. A hurricane is, an act of nature. But the city flooding. The source argues that was partly because the levees, mandated decades before, hadn't been properly maintained. There was willful blindness and corruption involved.
So you can't just blame the storm.
The ancient Hebrews acted, in this interpretation, as if the fundamental goodness of reality was a given, and their failures, their deviations, were the source of the problem. It's an almost insanely responsible stance, as the source calls it.
But the alternative?
The alternative is judging reality itself, criticizing being, and ultimately sinking into that corrosive, destructive resentment we talked about earlier.
So the source turns directly to you, the listener. If you're suffering, and let's face it, suffering is part of life. Life is tragic. And if you feel that suffering starting to twist you, starting to corrupt you, the advice is simple, but profound.
Consider your circumstances.
It asks you to look inward. Really honestly, are you taking the opportunities you actually have? Are you working as hard as you could be? Are you treating your family, your friends properly?
Are you dealing with your own bad habits? Are you shouldering the responsibilities you know are yours? Are you saying the things you need to say, the truthful things? Are you doing the things you already know deep down would make your life, and maybe the lives around you, better?
And if the honest answer to some of those questions is, well, no, not really, then the central instruction is incredibly direct.
Start to stop doing what you know to be wrong.
Just stop.
Stop today. Don't wait. And don't get bogged down trying to philosophically justify why it's wrong. Trust that inner sense. Your entire being can tell you something, the source says, even if you can't fully articulate it yet.
Stop the actions you feel ashamed of, the words you regret.
Start doing things you could speak of with honor. Let your own conscience, informed by the wisdom of your culture, be your guide.
And crucially, this demands focusing on yourself first. The source is very clear about what not to do at this stage.
Right. Don't blame capitalism, the radical left, or the iniquity of your enemies. That comes later, if at all.
The absolute priority is ordering your own life before you try to fix the state or reform the world. There's that quote, "If you cannot bring peace to your household, how dare you try to rule a city?"
The focus has to be inward first, listening to that inner wisdom.
And the source describes these really powerful, transformative effects that come from this commitment over time.
Yeah. Your head starts to clear. Your actual experience of the world begins to improve. Your judgment gets sharper. You start untangling the mess of your past. You become stronger, genuinely stronger.
Less bitter.
Much less bitter. More confident. You start piling your own self-generated misery onto the inevitable tragedies of life. You're left only with those inevitable bare tragedies, but they aren't compounded and magnified by your own resentment and deceit.
And the hope that emerges from that.
It's really powerful. A stronger soul can bear tragedy better. It doesn't spiral down into outright hellishness. Anxiety, resentment, so much of which comes from that internal conflict, knowing you're not living right, starts to recede.
And slowly, maybe hesitantly,
existence itself might start to look different, not like something to be cursed, but maybe, just maybe, as a genuine good. And by doing this intensely personal work, you might actually become a powerful force for peace in your own sphere.
The source even suggests that if everyone did this, focused on setting their own house in perfect order, the world might actually stop being an evil place.
And maybe, with enough effort, it could even stop being tragic. It's a radical idea about where real change actually begins. Not out there, but in here.
It really is. That the most profound way to engage with all the suffering and injustice might be this quiet, incredibly difficult personal act of confronting our own stuff, putting our own lives right.
So we've gone from those depths, that nihilistic rejection of existence, all the way to this empowering, practical path of personal responsibility. Transformation.
And that core directive echoes. Set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world.
And the source leaves us pondering something quite deep. It notes that we all contain wisdom that we cannot comprehend. So the final thought is, how can listening to that deep, often unclear inner wisdom, that feeling that tells you stop this, even when you don't fully know why, how can that actually guide us in setting our house in order? And could that quiet, personal battle with our own flaws, could that be the most potent way we have to make the world truly a better place?
Something definitely worth thinking about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.